going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you, everyone. So again, this is Sean Sheldrake. I'm Laura Knutson, and we are presenting today via this community webinar on the Portland Harbor Superfund Site Record of Decision. So very briefly, what we're going to do today is give a brief overview of the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. We're going to go over a map, timeline, basis for taking action, and contaminants of concern. We're also going to discuss the highlights of the proposed plan and record of decision. Specifically, we're going to focus on the comments that were collected during the public comment period and the impact that those comments had on the final cleanup plan or record of decision. We're also going to talk about work related to the final remedy, discuss community engagement activities that are ongoing and will continue into the future, and also, most importantly, provide an opportunity for your questions and so we can answer your questions. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Sean, and don't forget, you can make your screen full screen by clicking the 4 arrows right here if you want to see these maps better. And Sean, I'm going to hand it over to you, so go for it.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. And welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. I think this is a particularly exciting occasion now that we're beyond the record of decision or the cleanup decision for Portland Harbor. And we're excited to share the record of decision with you and go over how it's changed since the proposed plan last June tonight. But first, I'm going to look at the map here with you and point out the area that we're talking about that's subject to the record of decision. This area approximately from the second river mile of the Willamette up to about river mile 12, which is approximately the Broadway Bridge, for those of you that are familiar with the bridges in Portland. That's the area that is subject to the record of decision. Now, upstream of that area in the downtown reach, about river mile 12 to about river mile 16 and a half, just above the Ross Island area, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about important work the state is doing in the river in those areas, and we're also going to talk about important work the state has been doing also in the upland areas along the Willamette River within the area of our cleanup decision. Now, this area is, of course, an area of recreation for many, an important area for business, and it's also an important treaty-protected area for our tribes, the 6 tribes that have been participating in this cleanup study and the decision that we've got here to discuss tonight. Moving on to the next slide. So what neighborhoods are included in the record of decision area? Well, it's nearly the whole city. You know, what neighborhoods aren't included? It's a very expansive cleanup in terms of the area subject to the record of decision, but also areas that are upstream or upland of the cleanup that we're working hand in hand with the state and others to make sure support the cleanup that we're undertaking. So in terms of our history here, it's been a long investigation starting nearly back in the year 2000 and before that when problems were first discovered in the Willamette River in the harbor area going back to 1997, but listed on what we call the Superfund National Priorities List in 2000. And then going into the investigation phase over the next 16 years leading up to the proposed plan, which we took your comments on over 90 days last summer. And in reading through those, made a number of changes, which were documented in the record of decision. rolled out on January 6th of this year. So in terms of the timeline going forward, we've got ahead of us a number of different activities, but starting with the baseline sampling effort and pre-remedial design work throughout the harbor, which is estimated to take 1 to 2 years starting off now that we have the record of decision completed. In addition, I should also mention that we're undertaking with a variety of high priority areas and parties responsible for those remedial design whenever we can, where we have sufficient data to move forward and talk specifically about where to apply the technologies consistent with our cleanup decision, which we expect to take approximately 2 to 3 years. And then the cleanup itself, of course, taking approximately 13 years. And beyond that, we'll be reviewing the effectiveness of the cleanup every 5 years, which is required by the Superfund statute, and will include sampling that will take place probably every year in order to support those 5-year reviews and be able to speak to the effectiveness of the cleanup. And that long-term monitoring, say, of a cap containing contamination will help us make a determination of whether the remedy is protective or whether there are certain tune-ups that need to be undertaken to ensure it's protective of human health and the environment. And those 5-year reviews will go on into perpetuity because the waste that we will talk about addressing in our record of decision, some of it will be left in place and contained. So what is our basis for action? For human health, the greatest risk to people in the harbor is through eating fish, and particularly resident fish. That risk is exceptionally high for a particular subpopulation. Nursing mothers intake a certain amount of, for example, PCBs, which can become magnified and passed on to an infant. That's a particularly high risk that we found in our risk assessment for the harbor area. And those risks include both cancer risks as well as non-cancer risk. And when we talk about non-cancer risk, that might be impact to, say, a particular organ like the liver, or particularly the brain, that a particular contaminant has that's a non-cancer effect, but nonetheless harmful. Also, we found an unacceptable risk to ecological receptors, wildlife, both small and large, but particularly as we get further up the food chain, the biomagnification of certain contaminants can increase the risk, and is also a reason why we're taking action. So in terms of looking at what contaminants cause this concern, there are certain pervasive contaminants throughout the harbor that we've found are co-located with a number of some 60-odd contaminants in various concentrations, but that in focusing on this more limited list, we're able to more easily compare alternatives in the feasibility study, as well as propose a cleanup action in the proposed plan. And these are the contaminants where we have trigger levels for cleanup, active cleanup in the harbor. And because they're co-located with there are 60 some odd other contaminants that risks were found for. Those will help us get to those cleanup levels for all 64 chemicals of concern for the harbor over time. So the proposed plan, as many will recall, was issued in June of last year, and the proposed alternative was Alternative I, which included about 300 acres of active cleanup and cost about $745 million, and it included an on-site confined disposal facility. It relied to a great extent on monitored natural recovery, which I'll talk about more later, and it had enhanced natural recovery in some locations, which is essentially a thin sand layer applied to dilute and mix with contamination and diminish what fish might see in terms of contamination. So upon release of the proposed plan, we had a comment period that was 3 months long, and we received over 5,300 different letters, which were comprised of many comments in some cases each. So many thousands of comments, more than that even, primarily from tribes, community groups, businesses, as well as various governments.
And we also had some oral testimony, too, at our public meeting.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. That's a good point. And so in going through that volume of good comments, there were a number of issues that led us to change what we had proposed initially last June. And instead of Alternative I, the cleanup decision selected Alternative F modified, which is similar to Alternative F in all areas except for the navigation channel, where a higher trigger level was selected for those key contaminants. And it relies less on monitored natural recovery. And in addition, due to all the comments we received, as well as the Port of Portland's withdrawal of their support for the CDF, the Confined Disposal Facility at Terminal 4, that was withdrawn and is no longer part of the cleanup decision. The remedy that was selected will allow people to eat more fish sooner than Alternative I would have, and it also provides for more consistent triggers for cleanup throughout the river, no matter where you are, than Alternative I did. And it encompasses approximately 400 acres at the cost of $1 billion. So by the numbers, you can see the comparison in terms of the number of acres impacted, an increased construction time frame of about 6 years, and different dredging and capping volumes, just in quick summary. It also includes additional riverbank areas based on the additional areas that we'll be looking at in river. Those riverbanks will be evaluated adjacent to our in-river cleanups. So what does that look like? Well, in terms of, thank you, Laura, in terms of these different areas you see here, and the yellow hashed area are future maintenance dredge areas, so areas where dredging will be applied. The red areas, dredging with capping to contain residual contamination that's below that. Yellow areas, dredging only areas. Green, that would be capping to contain contamination, and those caps being evaluated over time to make sure they're still effectively containing contamination. And then blue areas, like in Swan Island Lagoon, connotes enhanced natural recovery, where a thin layer of sand would likely be placed to lower contaminant levels, but those would be allowed to mix over time. And then the bulk of the river, just like Alternative I in some respects, will be left to monitored natural recovery, which is essentially material coming in from upriver of lower concentration for our contaminants of concern, and allowing the whole river to achieve lower concentrations that fish would see, that people would see day to day, over time reducing the concentrations to our cleanup levels. So related work that's been going on for almost as long as the investigation itself, and important work that we've been relying upon to be ready for in-water cleanup. It's important to mention upland source control, which the State of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality leads in the areas that are along the river and upland. They've been working quite hard at reducing inputs of sources to make sure that we're ready for the in-river cleanup. And that important work is also something that the state DEQ is undertaking in upriver areas like the downtown reach. So when we talk about source control, we're talking about something the state is doing in the upland areas as well as upriver. And it's hard work they've been doing for, again, over a decade, that the cleanup in river is very reliant upon. And so they're further ahead of the cleanup by necessity, so that we'll be ready to go in water. Another aspect that I'll mention that's unrelated to the record of decision, but that the record of decision could benefit from, is the watershed approach that the state and EPA are jointly undertaking to reduce what might be input from the watershed as a whole into the harbor area, which could allow the cleanup to go further in terms of, for example, what fish meals people would be able to eat after the cleanup is completed and after levels have gone down over time to the concentrations that is more representative of what the whole Willamette watershed has. And so the first step in doing that is to take an inventory of what data has been gathered, what work has been done, and to find out what sort of inputs might be drivers to concentrations the watershed is seeing, for example, for PCBs. And if those PCBs that are input to the lower Willamette River are reduced, that could allow the record of decision Superfund cleanup work to go further in terms of what it would provide in terms of human health, protectiveness, and in fish meals. So what happens next? Well, we're just past the publication of the record of decision this past January, and we're moving into initial baseline monitoring, which will give us a point in time, now that we're several years past remedial investigation data collection, to compare to once we've finished construction. And again, the design of the remedy, and in certain key areas as well as pre-remedial design activity, will be taking place in parallel here now that we're post-record of decision, so that the harbor as a whole will be ready to get into construction as soon as possible. And all the while, the state will continue their important work that they've been doing quite well in terms of upland source control and also upriver. A lot of work has been accomplished in the downtown reach and will continue to be underway during this time. And we'll be approaching the community as we have over the last 17 years of the cleanup and making sure that we're now getting input on the important steps we're undertaking in terms of sampling and during construction, how that might be undertaking, what sort of monitoring might be appropriate at that time. And also, I'll mention that how sites are used. If those uses change, we're going to be continuing a dialogue with the community about what property uses will look like as time moves on so that the cleanup matches up with that. But also where there are opportunities, the cleanup will, work with habitat restoration work that the trustees and the tribes have been undertaking planning for. And in so doing, hopefully that'll provide additional habitat in the lower river where it fits in. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Laura.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone else for being on today. So some continued community engagement activities that I want to discuss are listed on the slide, so I'm going to be going into a little bit of detail about these. So one community engagement activity that is ongoing is a technical analysis of the record of decision. This was requested by the Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group, and the specific request was to have an analysis of how community comments and concerns were incorporated into the ROD, or final cleanup decision. And the goal of this is to help the community understand the ROD better. And so while the Portland Harbor CAG requested this support, I have been working with other groups too that are either affiliated with the CAG or a bit outside the CAG to kind of define what those comments and concerns and analysis areas are for the technical advisor that EPA has provided for this project. The technical advisor is doing an analysis independent of EPA, but EPA is providing the technical advisor for this work. There will be, in terms of products of this, a final report that the technical advisor is going to be giving, and that will be made available to everyone. And there also will be a public presentation by the technical advisor that will most likely be in April, but it is a tentative date at this point, and I need to work with the other groups that are involved with the analysis. But that will be announced when that is coming up. The other thing I'm working on, which is a core piece, and I would say right now is an update to the Community Involvement Plan, also called a CIP. And every Superfund site has a community involvement plan. Portland Harbor has had one since, soon after it was listed. And what the regulations require EPA to do at this point, after the ROD has been released, is to revisit that community involvement plan and review it to see if it needs to be updated. And I am doing that right now, and I do think it needs to be updated, and we need to do some additional community interviews as part of that update. And one of the things that I want to do is go into, different communities, maybe some low English proficiency communities, and conduct some interviews potentially in other languages. Obviously, we're going to need to work very closely with key community groups and others in order to update the plan, and I'm planning to involve the community, obviously, in that process. It's not going to be just a one-way street. And so the reason why this is such a core piece, and one of the reasons why the regulations require EPA to look at the community involvement plan at this point, is because of everything Sean just talked about. There's so much that's going on right now regarding, pre-remedial design, remedial action work, and we need to be able to have a core plan on how best to communicate that information, because there's so much that's going that's going on now and is going to be coming down the pike eventually. So another thing is the Superfund Job Training Initiative pilot, this one right here, and that is also called Super JTI. This is a program that EPA has applied successfully at other Superfund sites across the country. And what it is it is a program where EPA provides resources to train the local workforce in hazardous waste management and also other skills so that local community members can work on a Superfund cleanup. So this is something that we would like to apply at the Portland Harbor Superfund site. It's just a question of when, because right now, as Sean was talking, about we are starting to look at baseline sampling. The way that that usually works is the responsible parties are going to be conducting that work, and then they are hiring contractors to do that work. So it's a question of how many jobs those contractors that we're working with would be able to provide to local workforce people and community members. And that's a question. We're not sure. No agreements have been signed yet for that work. And so we're not sure exactly when we would be able to do this pilot because we don't know how many jobs would be available. And we want to make sure when we do the pilot that it would be enough jobs to make sense to do the pilot so it would be successful. And you can apply this program multiple times at a Superfund site. So as Sean said, the final cleanup plan is expected to take about 13 years once we actually start construction. So we could apply this Super JTI multiple times potentially. Lastly, I just want to mention the last bullet here is education and outreach efforts for fish advisories. So as Sean mentioned, the risk of eating fish is one of the main risks at this site. And as a result, we really, the ROD and the responsiveness summary too both outlined that additional education and outreach needs to accompany the fish advisory piece. So right now we do have fish advisory signs, which I'll go ahead and show a slide. This is the current fish advisory sign that the Oregon Health Authority has. So you can see bass, catfish, and carp are resident fish that you should not eat. Salmon and steelhead are okay because they're migratory. But we have signs right now. There are some signs along the river. There are about 4 more signs that we can put up along the river. And so EPA is working with the state and local authorities to do that, but also we're going to need to work with those same groups in order to develop a good education and outreach campaign to communicate this information. Because as you saw in a previous slide that Sean went over, fishing still occurs on the river even though we have these signs. So it's important, and that's why it's in the ROD and the responsiveness summary to work on a larger education campaign. And we're going to be involving community groups with that as well, obviously, and the broader community. So with that, we're almost done. I just want to mention that we do have a website, and that website is here. We also have some resources in the links box, which is on the screen too. You can click to our website there too, as well as some videos on MNR, monitored natural recovery that Sean mentioned, dredging, capping, monitoring. You can also, on our website, sign up for our listserv, and there's just a join our mailing list right here. You can type in your email address. Feel free also to just put in your email address into the Q&A pod, and I can sign you up. I'm assuming most of you probably are on the mailing list, but if you're not, please feel free. And with that, we are going to start taking your questions.